So the goals for today are really to increase understanding of rural education in respect to the broader national education policy, examining research on rural school community relationships, sharing demographics, data around rural school students, residents, and communities, as well as exploring research impact on out-migration. Kai will get into this in quite a bit of detail. Deepening understanding of the connection between out-migration and rural youth aspirations, as well as engaging in dialogue about the strategies to increase access to higher education opportunities across the region. With that, I want to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Kai Schaff, Associate Professor of Education, Department of Education, Policy Studies at Penn State. He is also the Associate Editor for the Journal of Research in Rural Education, a great leader in this area. He's also Director of the Center on Rural Education and Communities at Penn State. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Kai.
Thanks so much, Pam, and it's great to be here. I was here probably 4 or 5 years ago giving a sort of an opening talk. I think at that time I split it with John Sipple. So John, if you want to take the second half of this talk, you're more than welcome to come on down and join me. No, but it is really nice to be back here. I have my doctorate from Cornell in development sociology, and for my dissertation work, I spent an awful lot of time in rural communities all across New York looking at the issue of student transiency. And so driving up here yesterday, I was passing by these different exits and thinking, oh yeah, I was at that school district off that exit. Oh yeah, I remember that exit. So I spent a lot of time up here doing work in rural schools, which sort of led me down to Penn State ultimately. So at Penn State, I direct a center called the Center on Rural Education and Communities, and it's sort of a hybrid of a research and outreach effort that addresses rural education and community-related issues in Pennsylvania and the nation and the world. And, you know, not being trained in education per se, one of the things that was really interesting to me when I got down to Penn State and began to really immerse myself in the education research literature was the extent to which the research often seemed to me to be bounded by the walls of the classroom or the walls of the school itself. And rarely did the research really cross over into looking at issues around how school well-being interacts with community well-being. And so I kind of took that as sort of the guiding principle of this center and of the work that I've done since then, is to really look at all of these different issues that affect the well-being of both rural schools and rural communities. And in fact, it's a really broad range. And so over time, we've done all kinds of work looking at rural poverty, childhood obesity, rural youth aspirations, broadband diffusion, Indian education. Most recently, I've spent an awful lot of time looking at the school and community impacts of Marcellus shale gas development down in Pennsylvania. So the center has really taken on lots and lots of different kinds of initiatives. And I just recently stepped down as the editor of the Journal of Research in Rural Education. I still have my finger in the pot, though, as an associate editor. It's now being edited by Karen Epley, but the journal is folded into the center as well. And this is a journal that's been in existence since the early '80s, and I think it's a really good resource, which is why I wanted to flag it today. It is a rigorous, peer-reviewed, scholarly journal, and yet it is also all open access and online, with all of the articles archived going all the way back into the 1980s. So it's a really good resource if you're interested in rural education and community issues. And also, if you're interested in publishing in that area, I would encourage you to give it a thought. So what I'd like to do is to break this talk into 5 basic areas. The first being, what is rural? That might seem like a funny topic to begin with, but I think that it does bear a bit of discussion so that we really know what we're talking about. And as I'm going to mention in a minute, it's one of those funny kinds of topics that we think we know what it is, but actually, if you start picking it apart, it becomes a little bit less distinct. So, what is rural? How do we understand rurality in relation to school and community well-being? What's the relationship there? And then I'd like to talk about a couple aspects related to the context of rurality and rural education in relation to youth development and youth well-being, including the association between rural school and community well-being, rural student achievement, changing rural demographics, rural outmigration and brain drain. And then I'd like to talk about the ways in which we might strengthen education while at the same time building rural community. And I guess a lot of this work, a lot of this talk is based on a paper that will be forthcoming in the Peabody Journal of Education, where I really try to lay out the relationship or the relationship that could exist between a more articulated rural education policy and a more articulated rural development policy. So how can we think about rural policy or school policy as not simply being connected to student achievement, but really integrated into something that we might think of as rural development? And of course, one of the things that we know quite well is that achievement and academic outcomes are directly related to the socioeconomic status of students and households and communities. And so it seems to me that there is a real rationale for thinking about this rural education policy, rural development policy linkage. Okay, so I'd like to begin this conversation by simply asking what's rural. And it's a tricky concept that seems so intuitively obvious, but it becomes less obvious the more you examine it. And so I kind of think about this like asking someone what is art. Well, everyone knows what art is, but then if I really get you to dig into it, it becomes pretty indistinct pretty quickly. So there's a couple reasons why this is a tricky concept. One is that rural is institutionally defined in multiple ways, as I'm sure that you know. So, for instance, there are the metro, non-metro distinctions used by the Office of Management and Budget, the U.S. Census definitions, and the NCES metrocentric locale codes used in the Common Core data. So if we look at these, okay, census definitions, rural refers to open country and settlements with less than 2,500 people. So by this definition, as of 2010, about 19% of the population could be considered rural by residents, down from about 21% 10 years ago, or 15 years ago now. And despite the population concentrations in urban areas, the other side of the coin is that geographically, the U.S. remains a highly rural country in terms of the sheer land mass, as this map suggests. And also, I think you can think about the way we think about this country as, an urban country and an urbanizing country. But if you spent much time flying across the country and looking out the window of the plane, you spend an awful lot of time flying over vast stretches of empty and rural area. By contrast, the Office of Management and Budget designates counties as metropolitan or micropolitan, depending on the size of the urbanized area within them, with all the remaining counties designated as non-metro. And so, using these criteria, the non-metropolitan territory is not as extensive as the rural territory, but it's still significant. So about 75% of the U.S. landmass is non-metro, and about 16% of the population resides in non-metro areas. And this is a non-trivial distinction because we often throw around the term rural without really a lot of times referring to what rural we're talking about. And often non-metro and rural is used simultaneously, as is the census definition. But so this has operational limitations. So I live in Center County, which is up at the top there, and that's a metropolitan county. Although that scene with the Amish buggy going down the farm lane, that could literally have been taken a mile or so from my house. But it is a metropolitan county, which puts it into the same county category as Albany County or even Los Angeles County. So there are some issues there. And then there are the NCS Common Core Data urban-centric locale codes, which are based on a place's proximity to census-defined urban areas and classifies territories into 4 major types: city, suburban, town, and rural. And each type is then subclassified into 3 subcategories. So this typology allows for much more greater precision in defining an area and also provides a finer grain analytic potential. So that's good as far as that goes, although it gets complex pretty quickly. But the one criticism of all these approaches is that rural remains a residual category. That is, it's defined according to what it's not rather than what it is. And so in doing this, one of the main problems is that rural as residual tends to obscure these significant within category variations. Okay, so we've had sort of a brief discussion of these institutional approaches to defining rural, but it gets more complicated because rural also has these very strong symbolic meanings as well. And with this, we move away from the way that bureaucrats and policymakers think about rural to the way that rural people themselves think about where they live and what that means to them and who they are, but also the images that non-rural people have of rural America. So that is, places are not only rural because of particular structural or demographic or environmental characteristics, but because the people who live there think of themselves as being rural with respect to a set of social, moral, and cultural values. So Mike Arnold, who was a longtime figure in the rural education research world, he once said that when you lock your car on Sundays at church to keep the neighbors from putting zucchinis on the seat, you know you're probably in a rural place. And I've heard other people talk about rural in terms of distance, the distance one has to drive to get to a Walmart or a McDonald's restaurant or even a Starbucks. And it's interesting because it turns out that while approximately 82% of the U.S. population lives within a census-defined urbanized area, approximately the same proportion of the population lives within 20 miles of Starbucks. So, more to the point, a few years ago I traveled around to different rural communities conducting focus groups as part of a larger study, and I frequently heard comments like the following. So this one person says, "A lot of times I think this type of community is somewhat bred into these kids. And I'm just speaking from experience in that you want to sometimes come back to where your roots were and raise your kids how you were raised. So even though they want to get away and go to college or wherever, I think long term some of those kids usually end up back in this community or another one like it, like in my case." And then the second person says, "I was telling this teacher yesterday, I didn't see it myself, my daughter shared it with me, but my middle son, there's this new thing on Facebook, 25 random things about me. I don't know if you've heard about this or not. Anyway, one of the facts that my middle son put down was that he was raised on dirt roads, and that's where he wants to raise his kids." So there are these strong positive symbolic associations with rural and rurality, linking it to family and community and neighborliness, closeness to nature, self-reliance. But at the same time, it's also important to acknowledge the equally persistent negative stereotypes of rural as backwards, pre-modern, or even anti-modern, stereotypes that also affect how rural people see themselves and how other people view them. I'll never forget coming to Penn State and starting to work with PARS, which was the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools. And And I went to a PARS board meeting, which was made up of rural superintendents, because I had this idea that maybe in the educational leadership program where I'm based, we might be able to work with PARS to develop a rural administration certificate, a series of courses that would provide a certificate to rural administrators. And so I was kind of floating a trial balloon with these guys, and as I was doing it, I was looking around the room, and the faces were just they were very neutral, and I finished up and I said, well, what do you think? And one of the guys said, well, to tell you the truth, we appreciate the idea, but it wouldn't really help us, and in fact, it would probably hurt us more than anything else, because we're already stereotyped as rural superintendents and not able to handle the administrative challenges of a larger school district, which to me was kind of dumbfounding based on what I knew about the challenges and the multitasking and the kinds of skill sets that are needed by rural educators and rural administrators. And yet, there was this specter of these negative rural stereotypes rearing their heads. So we have the picture of the hillbilly and the Beverly Hillbillies, and it's really interesting to me to think back over the last 10 years or so, and sort of the rise of reality TV and these kinds of things, and how many of these shows have trafficked in these kinds of stereotypes. I mean, it really is an interesting cultural phenomenon, and you have to ask yourself, where is this coming from, and what is the appeal in all this? And there's sort of there's often a funny mixing of both negative and positive stereotypes. And if we go down the list, we can kind of think of Buck Wild, Duck Dynasty, maybe Honey Boo Boo. There was that show a couple years ago with Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie, and I don't think I ever saw it, but if I'm recalling correctly, these two society women go and live with rural poor people, and hilarity ensues as the clash of cultures happens. So anyway, these are very real symbolic associations with rurality and with rural people. So the other part of the difficulty in nailing down rural is the remarkable diversity of rural people and places. And this goes back to the criticism of rural as a residual category. And also, I think that this diversity presents some really significant challenges for public policy. Because public policy, in the ideal world, all places would be more or less equivalent, and so policy prescriptions could work equally across all places. But that's really not the case with rural. Rural is an incredibly diverse category, and so we can look at a couple different pictures of rural. And here is Tidewater, Maryland, not too far from where I grew up, and that seems rural. But then here is West Virginia. And an Appalachian community of Bradshaw in the coal mining area. There's Yazoo, Mississippi, down in the Black Belt. Story County, Iowa. Again, another kind of rural. Bisbee, Arizona. Nia Bay, Washington, and on the land of the Makah Nation. And probably the most rural place I've ever been, Deep Springs, California. Surely among the most remote places in the lower 48, and yet simultaneously located in one of the most urban and populated states in the nation. So the social, the economic, the demographic, the political, the institutional contexts of rural vary widely across all of rural America, complicating complicating how we might approach educational policy and rural educational policy. And speaking of rural diversity, so rural America is marked by significant variation in history, culture, landscapes, economic foundations, and its people. And rurality is often imagined as a white space. And here you have this imagination in the form of the fictional Mayberry, home of Andy Griffith, and actually modeled after Mount Airy, North Carolina. And in fact, if you look at the data, rural America as a whole is less diverse than urban America. And this holds true not only for broader populations overall, but also for school populations. And yet patterns of diversity vary considerably by region, state, and locality. So nationwide data obviously can hide significant regional variations in ethnic and racial concentration. So for example, 90% of African Americans living in non-metro areas live in the southern regions of the US. This compares slightly more than 6% in the Midwest and less than 2% in the West. And additionally, 4 states have rural school populations that are more than 50% non-white. So I mentioned that Mayberry was based on Mount Airy, North Carolina, and yet North Carolina now has the 9th largest non-white student population, reflecting demographic shifts that, as we speak, are having some significant impacts on electoral politics and shifts in voting patterns. And while we're talking about rural diversity, if this is something that's of interest to you, let me give a plug to Mara Teakin's new book, Why Rural Schools Matter, and Mara will be talking later on today, so I highly recommend that. And this is a wonderful, wonderful book, both about rural education and school community connections and issues of racial and socioeconomic diversity within rural contexts. So highly recommended. Okay. So furthermore, although rural population growth is slowing, diversity in America, rural and otherwise, is growing. So for example, between 2000 and 2010, minority populations accounted for 83% of the population gain in non-metro America. This rural diversity is particularly pronounced among children. 18% of the rural adult population is minority in comparison with 28% of the child population. 356 non-metro counties now have a rural youth population that's majority minority, and another 178 non-metro counties are near majority minority. So demographers project that in 6 years, whites will be a minority among school-age populations, and by 2042, whites overall will be a minority population. And here is a map showing patterns of non-metropolitan minority child populations as of 2010, and you can see the Black Belt and the areas around the Colonia areas in the Southwest as heavily minority. Arizona, California, Utah, and Nevada all have minority-majority non-metro counties. In short, patterns of racial and ethnic diversity are changing in rural America, and this has real consequences for rural education in terms of changing populations with specific needs such as ESL, and also in thinking about the relationships between spatial inequality and social inequality, and the extent to which changing racial compositions are also accompanied by deepening inequalities and poverty concentration. Okay, so why should we care about rural people and places, rural communities and youth? Why should we care? As a suggestion, this is something I did last night. I took a look at the presidential candidates' websites just to see what they had to say about rural people and places, rural communities. It was illuminating. I'll let you do that for yourself. But why should we care about rural people and places? Well, despite the fact that we're living in an urban and an urbanizing country and world, nearly 75% of the U.S. is non-metropolitan and home to 51 million people. So we can compare this to other important groups. Latino Hispanics, people 65 and over, African Americans, Asians, American Indians, Alaska Natives. So non-metro America is home to 51 million people. It's a lot of people. Let's think about rural schools and the young people who attend rural schools. So nearly 32,000 schools and nearly 10 million students are rural, making up about 32% of schools and nearly 20% of students, 1 in 5. Yet, despite these figures, my argument is that within policy, research, and academic circles, rural education is a residual analytic category, just as it occupies a residual spatial category in many of the urban-rural classifications that are typically used. It's what's left over. So a couple of years ago, I did an experiment, and I guess this was in part a result of my trying to publish some rural work in some of the top tier education journals, and it's interesting if you try to do that, even with really good work, a lot of times you'll get a response which goes something along the lines of, well, this looks like really interesting work, but because it has such a specific rural focus, you may want to consider targeting this to a journal that deals with rural education more directly, or something along those lines. It's very interesting. So between 2004 and 2014, I looked at the top 5 ranked education research journals, and I did a keyword search for urban and rural in the titles and the abstracts of all the articles published in this 10-year period, and found 64 urban-oriented articles and only 5 rural-oriented articles. And one of those 5 was mine. So it's just very interesting to think about peripheries and peripheralization, and how spatial peripheries correspond or coincide with political peripheries and peripheries of power and peripheries of influence. So, nonetheless, despite our broader societal bias towards urban places and urban culture, the U.S. remains not only geographically a very rural place spatially, but significant proportions of its population are rural and likely to remain so for quite some time. So how can we think about the rural context in terms of youth and school and community well-being? Well, I think the first conclusion to make based on this discussion so far is we need to keep in mind that one of the primary characteristics of rural America is its diversity. So therefore, we need to be careful about the ways in which we make generalizations about rural people and places, understanding not only regional differences, but also differences across individual communities. At the same time, we need to understand that the most effective solutions to the challenges that rural communities face with regards to young people will very likely be context-specific in their nature. So that is, they will reflect a community's pressing needs, its resources, its opportunities, and its constraints. So it's very interesting, this last point. A couple of years ago, we were charged with a funder to develop a how-to guide for farm-to-school programs in Pennsylvania. And so what we did was we did a survey of all the food service providers in public school districts in Pennsylvania, and we coupled that with a series of 8 or 10 different case studies. And as we got more and more into it, we realized that maybe there was no such thing as farm to school, but there were farm to school programs. We found an incredibly diverse array of practices that could loosely be lumped together under this category of farm to school, but they were very, very distinct from each other. And what made them distinct? Well, they were made distinct along the lines of local needs, local resources, local constraints, and local salient issues. And so these programs really reflected the local logics and the local realities of the communities in which they were based. And so it made for some real challenges in writing up this how-to guide, because there wasn't any one how-to beyond really the basic concepts associated with farm-to-school programming, for one thing, and then the finding that we had that it's really important to understand, to map out the local environment and to understand what the local needs, resources, and constraints are. So, so keeping some of these cautions in mind about making generalizations and keeping local context at the forefront, let's think about some of the challenges that seem to disproportionately affect rural communities and challenges that have a direct impact on young people. So let's start with poverty. We often think about poverty as an issue that principally affects cities, and yet it often comes as a surprise to people when they learn that in this country, non-metropolitan poverty rates have always been higher than metropolitan poverty rates. And I often point this out in talks that I give. In fact, only central city poverty rates are higher than non-metro rates. So this is an issue not only for institutional capacity, but also in terms of the student populations enrolled within rural schools. So Streams and colleagues, for instance, note that among the 10 states with the highest incidence of poverty, 36% of students and 57% of school districts are located in rural areas. Over 26% of all children in non-metro America currently live in poverty, an increase of about 4.5% from just 5 years ago. And it's not exactly a news flash that poverty is also tightly linked with a host of other risk factors. In rural areas, this might manifest in several different ways. And one is drug abuse. And similar to poverty, we often think about drug abuse as an urban issue, but closer examination suggests that, again, this is not a warranted conclusion. So while a few years ago methamphetamine was really a major concern in a lot of the communities in New York and certainly in Pennsylvania and across the country, it seems pretty clear that this is becoming supplanted by prescription opioid abuse and increasingly heroin, which has become prevalent. So a recently published study using nationally representative data found that 8.6% of rural youth had reported prescription drug abuse within the previous year, and that's in contrast to 6.5% of urban youth. State and federal officials have in a variety of ways also clamped down on prescription opioid abuse, including FDA approval of abuse-deterrent forms of prescription painkillers. And as a consequence, the availability on the black market has gone down and the price has gone up. And as this has happened in many places, heroin has come in to fill the demand from addicts who can no longer afford and who no longer have ready access to prescription painkillers. When I was growing up in D.C., it was at the, I lived probably 2.5 blocks from Walter Reed Army Medical Center, and a lot of the Vietnam vets were housed there, and a lot of them had addiction problems and heroin addiction problems, and so I always associated heroin problems with the inner city and with and specifically with my past, thinking about the problems with returning vets, now these days I live in a small town. Probably 1,200 people, and we absolutely have heroin in our town. I know a couple of people who are in rehab. We had to deal with a guy a year or so ago who passed out in our yard, and this is a small rural town. Heroin is cheap and available. In Pennsylvania, a bag of heroin can be bought for approximately the cost of a pack of cigarettes or a 6-pack of beer, and Pennsylvania is not an outlier. Childhood obesity. We often assume that rural areas provide lots of opportunities for physical activity and healthy outdoor activities. However, children living in rural areas are about 25% more likely to be overweight or obese than their peers in metro areas. So rural communities often face unique challenges when it comes to obesity prevention, Geographical distances between home and opportunities for physical activity and healthy eating can place a time and cost burden on families. Rural areas often have much more limited private and public health care opportunities that provide access to childhood obesity interventions. So compared to children in urban or suburban families, rural youth face lower access to health care, lower levels of physical activity, poorer quality food, and limited options for transportation. So these challenges, along with the challenges associated with the high rate of poverty in rural areas, can make it difficult to implement some of the healthy and active living changes that are often recommended by childhood obesity prevention literature. And then we have a number of processes and factors that we might generally categorize as rural community decline. Now, before I get into this, we established earlier that rurality is exceptionally diverse. And the same holds true for the economic conditions in rural America. Some places are doing quite well with healthy, diversified economies, and some places are gaining population and attracting wealthier immigrants. And here we might think about rural retirement destinations or places that have high amenity recreational opportunities or that are finding other ways of achieving economic and social vitality. But in many places in rural America, this is just not the case. I was doing a study some years ago on rural youth aspirations, and this is the study that I was doing these focus groups for, and I was at a site in northern Maine talking with students and community members and educators about the rural school and community well-being, rural youth aspirations, and this was an area that was completely decimated by the collapse of the logging industry, literally had no economy to speak of whatsoever. Families were taking in foster children to boost the enrollments in the school so that the school wouldn't close. I went down to Bangor and visited with a friend of mine, and he had a friend of his that was over from that area, and his friend said to me, "Oh, you got to tell those people, you got to tell those young people, they got to leave. They got to get out of there because there's nothing there for them. That's the best thing you can do is tell them to leave." And I'll never forget, shortly after, come to Pennsylvania, to Penn State, speaking to a rural superintendent who told me flatly, "My job is to give the students I work with the knowledge and the skills they'll need to be successful elsewhere because there are no opportunities for them here." That is a stunning statement. My job is to give the students I work with the knowledge and the skills they'll need to be successful elsewhere because there are no opportunities for them here. The irony is that that superintendent was based in Bradford County. I don't know if you know Bradford County, but Bradford County, a few short years later, became the epicenter for shale gas development. And it blew up with shale gas development, and then within the last year or so, as global petroleum prices have fallen and the supply has increased, it has now gone into a bust cycle again. So anyway, communities like these are characterized not only by stagnant economies, but by shrinking and aging populations. And I'd like to speak briefly about the issue of rural outmigration of younger and more highly educated people from rural areas. So what we have here is a historical process. If you look at national level data of net rural outmigration, but not simply net rural outmigration, but selectivity in migration streams. So there are specific people who are moving out, and there's also people moving in, but there are specific streams and specific demographic characteristics of those streams. So what we need to do is we need to ask ourselves, what are the consequences for both sending and receiving areas? So the key questions then, how do immigrants compare with outmigrants? And with regard to rural, urban patterns, typically outmigrants from rural areas tend to be younger, better educated, wealthier. Immigrants tend to be older, less well educated, poorer. How do stayers compare with leavers? How do out-migrants compare with the destination population? How do immigrants compare with the destination population? So, what's really interesting here is that economic decline can happen within a place without any, closing of business or anything like that, but simply as a matter of selectivity of migration streams. So there was a book that came out a couple of years ago called Hollowing Out the Middle by Patrick Carr and Maria Kafalis, and that book gained a fair amount of attention in the media, and they did a year-long study, an ethnographic study of a rural community out in the Midwest, and the processes by which young people made decisions about their future lives, where they were going to live, what they were going to do, so on and so forth. And what they found in this study was that the school and the community worked together to establish norms of success, and those norms of success were defined by students, young people leaving the rural community and going out into the bigger and broader world to find success elsewhere. And furthermore, that these were the students that they really focused the most attention on. And so at the end of this year-long study, the researchers met with the school board, and I quote from the book, "We took a provocative line and rhetorically asked, 'You do realize, don't you, that because you do your job so well here, that you're basically making sure that the best students leave Ellis, the town, and the odds are that they won't come back?' The principal was the only one to speak. 'This is the job we set out to do,' he stated matter-of-factly. Most people felt it was their job to ensure that the best kids got all the help they needed, and that inevitably meant that they would move away. Certainly he understood that the school plays a pivotal role in this process, but he concluded that the job of an effective educator was to nurture and send off talented youth, despite the fact that doing so meant the town was slowly committing suicide." So this is what they found. And we'll return to that shortly. But first, let's talk about what is right with rural communities and what some of the protective factors might be and what this may mean for practice. And let's look first at student achievement. A body of scholarship suggests that the social and academic benefits of smaller school environments, although others have argued that rural schools, by virtue of their decreased size and capacity, are less able to offer the breadth of curricular options in comparison to their urban and suburban counterparts. Overall, however, data suggests that rural schools tend to perform relatively well in academic assessments in comparison with their urban and suburban counterparts. In general, if we look at the National Assessment of Educational Progress, reading and mathematics scores, only suburban schools outperform rural schools. Let's see here. Other figures are not quite as promising when it comes to post-secondary transitions in college enrollment, though, and there are a number of barriers, including cost, proximity to higher education institutions, mismatches between college degrees and local labor markets, and so forth. So this is an area that needs to be examined more closely. The rural school community connection. The school-community relationship is arguably accentuated in rural areas. First of all, rural schools have tremendous symbolic importance to the rural communities and function as a key site of civic interaction and intergenerational identity. And I often tell this story of being in a school in rural eastern Washington and doing focus groups out there, and I was between focus groups and spending time in the atrium of the high school. And I looked on the wall and I noticed all these wonderful photographs of classes, graduating classes, and there was the most recent graduating class, and the one next to it was the year before, and the year before, and the year before, and I looked, and I went all the way around the room, all the way back to the 19-teens, which was amazing to me that all these graduating class photographs were on the wall that dated back almost 100 years, and I went into this focus group with community members, and I said, I got to tell you, it was really interesting waiting for you guys because I got to look at all these photographs, and that's really kind of cool. And they said, well, yeah, we're up on those walls. Our teachers are up on those walls. Our grandparents are up on those walls. And I began to think about what it would be like to be a student at that school and to see your teacher's graduating photograph, your parents' graduating photograph, and know that at one point your photograph would be up there as well. So schools, rural schools, often have this tremendous importance in terms of engendering this sense of intergenerational identity. Rural schools are also characterized by their smaller size, not surprisingly. Nearly 64% of schools in rural areas have 400 or fewer students, but this is the same is true for only 39% of city schools. And similarly, while only about 16% of students in cities attend schools with 400 or fewer students, in rural areas overall nearly one-third of students attend schools that size. And in the most rural remote areas, over 75% of students attend schools with 400 or fewer students. Parents of rural students are more likely to attend school events or volunteer on school committees than their non-rural counterparts. In comparison to urban settings, teachers in rural schools also report fewer problems with students and higher levels of job satisfaction. In many rural places, the school is often the area's largest employer. So because of these characteristics, rural schools are often described as fostering especially strong social ties, given their smaller size and closer linkages to the communities that they serve. The presence of a school within a community can also be strongly related to elevated indicators of broader social and economic welfare, including housing values and local employment. I mentioned the Journal of Research in Rural Education, and there's a quite influential article that was published there by Tom Lyson, who was a faculty member at Cornell, and the article was entitled, I believe, "What a School Means to a Community," and is a very interesting analysis of census data comparing small communities in New York State that had schools versus those that didn't, and the differences in a variety of social and economic indicators, all of which seem to strongly suggest that elevated indicators were associated with the presence of the school. Okay, so this means that those in positions of leadership within a rural school district, including the superintendent and the school board members, necessarily assume not only educational leadership roles, but local economic development roles as well. Therefore, those in leadership positions within rural schools are not only the subjects of public scrutiny, but are far more frequently required to assume community outreach roles and hone community relationship building skills in ways that are less common within urban settings. I'm based in a program called, an educational leadership program, and one of the things that this work has done for me over the years is really forced me to think about not only what educational leadership means, but what specifically rural educational leadership means. And I'm convinced that it has to do with a recognition of the importance of these ties between school and community, and practice that builds on and strengthens these ties. So in other words, much more so than in many other places, the relationship between rural schools and the communities they serve is a deeply symbiotic relationship. Healthy schools beget healthy communities and vice versa. Alternately, this is one of the reasons why the threat of consolidation and school closure is so controversial and anxiety-provoking in rural areas, because of the ways in which schools play such critical local economic, symbolic, and social roles. Okay, so where does this leave us? On the one hand, schools are fundamentally local institutions run by locally elected school boards and occupying the nexus of community, educational, social, and economic activity. Educators and educational leaders must therefore be cognizant of and responsive to local needs and issues. On the other hand, schools are institutions of the state and are beholden to the state and national level interests, mandates, and directives. And this tension has deep roots within rural education in the U.S. In the first decades of the 20th century, school reformers in the U.S. began to talk about what became known as the rural school problem. So what reformers were arguing was that rural schools were just too inefficient for the demands of a rapidly changing, urbanizing, and globalizing society. Sound familiar? People in rural communities, reformers believed, were simply ill-equipped to run their own schools and prepare students to be economically competitive and productive in a modernizing world. The solution offered was to make rural schools look a lot more like urban schools, larger, bureaucratized, run by educational professionals rather than locals, and informed by the latest pedagogical knowledge. And in many respects, the debate and the central tensions remain strikingly similar today. And again, I think it's interesting to see how this debate in various ways even bubbles up into our current election debates. Canapel and de Young argued nearly a century later, in 1999, that at the heart of the rural school problem is the conflict over the purpose of schooling, with state and national reform leaders typically calling for schools to prepare students to contribute to national interests, while rural education scholars and probably many rural parents believe that rural schools should also serve local community interests. So to me, this is really, really interesting because it raises these quite difficult questions about the nature of education and the nature of accountability. We throw around words like accountability all the time. But then, I think we can ask, well, to whom is education accountable? Whose purposes does education serve? So this is not to say that educational improvement and raising test scores is not desirable, or that we don't want our students to be economically competitive in an increasingly volatile and global economy, but it is to suggest why educational researcher and sociologist Michael Corbett has referred to contemporary schooling within rural areas as the quintessential institution of disembedding. That is, a set of practices that privileges standardization, efficiency, and business models of school management, in the process severing attachment to place and producing mobile, adaptable youth who can flexibly respond to changing labor market conditions on a national and indeed a global scale. So the critique is that standards require curricula and assessment that is purposefully decontextualized, and because curricular standards are so extensive, little opportunity remains for teachers to engage students in curricula tied to locale. Students are geared towards competitiveness in a global marketplace rather than in a local arena, and in a high-stakes accountability environment, the opportunity cost for place-based education may simply just be too high. Or, as a rural administrator once told me, if it doesn't raise test scores, it's just not relevant to my job. Okay, what an interesting quote. So what is education? What is accountability? If it doesn't raise test scores, it's just not relevant to my job. So here's some further evidence that somehow schooling is becoming more distanced from the local and lived realities of students. An annual survey of U.S. high school seniors conducted through the University of Michigan, and this is not just rural, but national, found that 34.6% of students in 1983 reported that their courses were quite or very interesting, while 19.8% found their courses slight or very dull. In 2005, only 21.2% found their courses quite or very interesting, and 33.3% found their courses slightly or very dull. In 1983, over 40% of seniors found their coursework often or always meaningful. By 2005, that figure dropped to 27.5%. And we see very similar changes regarding the percentage of seniors believing that their schooling would be quite or very important later in life. Okay, so this is an educational outcome, right? It's not the kind of educational outcome we often think about, but this is an educational outcome. And if we take this a little bit further, it's an outcome that raises different kinds of questions about the nature of education and about the nature of accountability. Okay, so rural schools hold enormous symbolic, cultural, and economic importance to the communities they serve. Yet schools can't survive long if the communities they serve are experiencing unchecked economic decline and social fragmentation. Therefore, it's in the best interest of both the school and the community to work together towards the mutual enhancement and well-being. So that is, and here's how I think about rural educational leadership: enlightened educational leadership that takes seriously the 21st century needs of students, as well as the communities in which they reside, cannot help but interpret academic and community betterment not as mutually exclusive, but as fundamentally mutually reinforcing priorities. If left unattended, community development is likely to garner insufficient emphasis in programs that prepare future leaders for rural schools. And both school system and community leaders are realizing their future success and perhaps survival will depend less on going it alone and more on building collaborative partnerships with old and new entities. Okay, and here's something else. You remember our discussion of rural brain drain and the suggestion that schools and educators were perhaps part of the problem in encouraging the best and brightest of their students to leave their home communities for elsewhere. Well, in a large study of rural youth aspirations that involved collecting survey data and talking with educators and community members and young people in rural communities around the country, we found, in fact, that it simply wasn't as simple as that somehow the school was to blame for the rural outmigration. The community members, the unthinking community members, were just sort of telling people to go elsewhere because that's where the success is. We found that in some places, indeed, educators, like that rural superintendent I mentioned, encourage young people to go and find success elsewhere. But those people tended overwhelmingly to be in places that were experiencing pronounced economic problems, places where there really weren't opportunities for young people. That is, this encouraging to leave wasn't something that was done uncritically by educators and community members. More importantly, what we found was that the young people with the most attachment to their home communities were those that tended to be the most high achieving. Think about that for a minute. So in the demographic literature, the people who tend overwhelmingly to outmigrate from rural areas are sort of the, quote unquote, the best and the brightest. But these are the people who are the most attached to their home community, the most attached to schooling. How do you explain that? How do you explain it? What do you think? Any ideas? Yeah.
School was a positive experience for them. They become high achievers partly by being involved in lots of civic organizations.
Totally. Exactly. Yeah, so these are the students who have grown up having all these positive associations with the local school and with the local community and being integrated. So, okay, so I think that's a fair hypothesis or a fair explanation, and it seems to square pretty well with my experiences. But then, how do you explain why they tend to be the ones who overwhelmingly leave the community? If they're the most attached, then why do they leave? There aren't jobs. There's no jobs. It's the economy, stupid. Right? It's that kind of thing. Yeah, there's no jobs. There's no opportunity. There's no opportunity. So whereas Carr and Kafalis had done their study in one place, we had these survey data from 73 different rural schools, and then had done follow-up site visits and focus groups and fairly intensive qualitative work in another 12 communities. And it was really, really interesting what we found. In fact, in some places where the community was actually, had some opportunities for youth. Here's another question for you. In places where rural communities had some opportunity for youth, in fact, there were strong norms to encourage young people to leave. Now, why would that be? Okay, you got a community. It's doing pretty good economically. There are opportunities for young people, but there's encouragement from community members and educators for students to leave the community.
Leave for college and come back.
Yeah. The encouragement to leave those communities, Samar says to leave for college and come back. The encouragement to leave those communities is based on a couple of things. One, the assumption, the strong assumption that young people have strong community attachment. Number two, that they'll leave, but they'll come back. Or at least a number of them will come back. And when they come back, what do they bring with them? They bring with them education, experience, maybe spousal partners. They bring with them formal institutional connections, informal social connections, and they make the community more networked and able to access all these new and different kinds of resources. So what we found then was something quite different from this more simplistic narrative, which I had problems with because it seemed like it, there over the last 10 or 15 years, there's been a real tendency within public discourse to bash educators, to bash teachers, and I sort of felt like, in some ways, that book was buying into that discourse. But really, what we found was that the issue was not about uncritical norms and stereotypes that you can't find success in rural areas, but rather the issue was economic development and opportunities for youth. That was really it. Okay, so what does this mean then for an expanded vision of rural education policy and indeed the leadership roles assumed by rural educators and administrators? First, it means that the vision should go well beyond the more conventionally defined boundaries of schooling and educational and include the ways in which schools represent a critical part of rural community economic development, social well-being, and community sustainability. And this vision of rural educational leadership, I argue, is pragmatic. It's not pie in the sky. It's pragmatic in the sense that the priorities of quality educational provision and strengthening communities are not mutually exclusive, but they're deeply interconnected. So rethinking this relationship between rural education and rural development means going beyond a discussion of education that focuses on test scores as a standard measure of academic achievement and school success to reconsider and strengthen the school-community linkage with an eye towards creating new opportunities in rural communities that capitalize on the strong connections and commitments of place that many young people feel in rural areas. And it also means thinking flexibly in ways that take into account these unique assets, the unique conditions that are present within rural schools and rural communities. So now I'd like to turn to the practitioner end of things. What does an integrated approach to rural school and community development mean for educators and administrators? In my work with the Pennsylvania Association of Rural and Small Schools, one of the things that we've done is to offer an annual award called the Building Community Award, which recognizes a rural school or school district that demonstrates innovative practices by strengthening education while at the same time building community. I think that it's really important to try to identify these exemplars. I think they're all over the place. But we tend to focus on what's not working so well rather than what really is working well, and I think it's really important to highlight these instances of success. And so every year we have been issuing these awards, and this is an example that appeared in a book chapter I wrote a couple years ago. But St. Mary's Area Middle School is located in northern Pennsylvania in a heavily forested, sparsely populated area. The school has an enrollment of about 550 students, and it's located on a multiple acre tract of land, much of it wooded. The strong traditions of hunting and fishing, Forestry provides an important economic base to the area's economy. And because of this, it's a little surprised that a significant share of the school's efforts and activities reflect this identity and contain a strong emphasis on natural sciences and environmental stewardship. So over the past several years, St. Mary's Middle School has spearheaded a set of coordinated environmental education initiatives that draw from the local context and dovetail with curricula in ways that speak directly to the lived local experience, the centerpiece of which is the development of a regional environmental learning center funded through a series of grant sponsorship and student-led fundraisers. This is all done with grant money. So none of this came out of the local tax dollars. Originating from microbiology lessons conducted in a stream flowing through the school's campus, it occurred to St. Mary's educators that there was an important untapped opportunity to adapt the science curricula in ways that would take direct advantage of the natural environment, literally at the school's doorstep. So they raised funds from a variety of local and state level sources, made use of community and student volunteer labor, and the school designed and constructed what has become a student-managed trout nursery that currently raises and releases over 1,000 trout into local streams each year. In Pennsylvania, a lot of times you'll see, and maybe this is in New York as well, you'll see schools raising trout within classrooms and this kind of thing. But this was really sort of an expanded effort, a real bona fide, full-on aquaculture effort. And so they built this trout nursery, and they integrated it, interestingly, into the local curriculum and in a way that was completely responsive to state academic standards. So students are completely responsible for managing water quality, feeding, stocking, and controlling for disease, monitoring the production of effluent. So they record data on trout health, feeding habits, stress levels, and appearance, and they assist in maintaining the tanks and the fish raceways. And the interesting thing about this project was how it just sort of grew and grew. They decided to create an outdoor classroom to accompany the trout nursery, and at the time that they were doing that, they realized that they had this issue with effluent. What did you do with the wastewater from the trout? And they thought, well, what if we built a greenhouse complex that would be a natural extension of the aquaculture project and would provide students with a hands-on opportunity to investigate hydroponics and aquaponics as a means of addressing water quality. So through the greenhouse complex, the students discharge this nitrogen-rich wastewater from the trout nursery. It's filtered through the soils that in turn support plants grown in the greenhouse. And the school brings in seniors from the community, this Green Thumb group of seniors who then work with the students within the greenhouse. And the students became involved in efforts to use the wastewater to grow niche plant species that could be used in the environmental remediation of acid drainage at local mining sites. And this was an effort that was coordinated by the Elk County Conservation District and the local campus of the Penn State University. There are additional plans to expand the greenhouse effort in the form of an intergenerational gardening project, and the Environmental Learning Center additionally has a strong focus on alternative and renewable energy. So a grant-funded 1.5 kilowatt wind turbine helps to provide energy for use in the outdoor classroom and for the trout nursery. What they're trying to do is to get the entire thing completely off-grid. And this is coupled with 3 mobile solar labs for use in science instruction. Additional fixed solar panels are planned for the outdoor classroom with plans for students to monitor the output, which will then be used to power the batteries for a green golf cart used to transport things across the school campus. And the middle school is now pursuing plans to produce biodiesel fuel from waste cooking oil. So in sum, it's difficult not to be struck by these efforts, how they address community issues in a variety of practical and applied ways, their thematic integration and how they link school and students with the broader community, the ways in which social and institutional networks, both formal and informal, have developed through these efforts, and the ways in which academic instruction has been seamlessly superimposed onto multiple hands-on, student-driven, and locally relevant learning opportunities. And there's the outdoor classroom complex. Okay, so rural schools as drivers of rural economic development. Educational attainment without economic opportunity is likely to result in the outmigration of a rural community's best and brightest. But this can be changed if local opportunity structures can likewise be changed. By providing skills and education to cohorts of young people, schools help to create a competitive workforce that represents a strong asset to local business. Further, a strong school is an important community asset that reflects not only the residential decision-making of households with children, but also where employers choose to locate. Beyond these factors, however, schools can additionally work in more purposive ways to enhance local economic development opportunities. School community partnerships, for example, can integrate academic and vocational education in numerous ways through service learning, building collaborations with local businesses through job shadowing, mentoring, and school-to-work programs, and apprenticeship opportunities. And this can accomplish several goals at once, I think. First of all, it strengthens the formal and informal ties between local educational, business, and social service institutions, enhancing coordination and communication. And this enables educators to gain clear ideas regarding workforce and post-secondary training opportunities for young people, as well as the skills and knowledge in demand for these positions. Secondly, it helps to build connections between young people and local businesses. This provides young people with real-world skill building and important opportunities for evaluating possibilities for local employment, while at the same time providing businesses with the possibilities to attract the next generation of workers. Some might see school-to-work system benefiting only the individual student and the potential employer, but the ultimate success of school-to-work partnerships might be in connecting students to their community and future work by giving them a better understanding of the rural place in which they live, the opportunities that are there, and where they may someday work. Young people also represent a critical, though often overlooked, asset in community development and community building. And this is ironic to me, given that it is young people who arguably have the greatest stake in the future of their communities. Schools can enhance student voice, agency, and participation through educational and administrative practices that work strategically to create new opportunities, norms and structures that enable young people to become both partners and collaborators in school and community change. Place-based education, while not necessarily specifically oriented towards community or local economic development, can nonetheless have development outcomes. So I've written elsewhere, for example, about rural place-based initiatives. Projects like this occur in schools across rural America, yet for the most part go unnoticed, much to the disadvantage of the broader knowledge base regarding school-based educational initiatives that dovetail in a variety of ways with local rural development efforts. So rural school engagement and community development is not simply a matter of retaining young people within rural places, keeping them on the farm, and stemming rural outmigration, but rather the goal is to strengthen and support local economies while providing young people with new and perhaps unanticipated imaginations for adult life within their home rural communities or a community like it. A future local life that at the same time does not preclude and in fact may even encourage an extended period of living experience outside the home place. Successful community development efforts will be deeply reflective of local opportunities, needs, and constraints, and therefore, perhaps to the dismay of policymakers looking for a quick fix, both deeply dependent upon local knowledge and resistant to external templates for prescriptive intervention. Another way of thinking about schools as sites of rural development is through the cultivation of rural educators. And in fact, I would refer you again to the Journal of Research in Rural Education, and there's a very nice article on this just recently published by Mary Beth Mattingly and colleagues from the Carsey Institute out of University of New Hampshire. Since rural schools represent a primary source of employment in rural areas, they can provide obvious career options for rural youth who'd like to remain in their home communities. But rural schools often have difficulty in recruiting and retaining teachers and administrators, and the smallest and poorest rural schools tend to have larger shares of inexperienced teachers. Some positions are especially difficult to fill in rural areas, including instructional positions in math, science, and special ed. For these reasons, many rural schools have tried to address teacher recruitment using grow-your-own strategies involving efforts to identify and recruit local residents interested in becoming qualified to teach in area schools. This might also include programs aimed at high school students who may be considering the teaching profession. Grow-your-own strategies make sense since teachers typically want to teach in schools like the ones they attended and live in communities similar to and or near where they grew up. So a fruitful strategy for grow your own efforts involves partnerships with area community colleges and universities. And a number of these programs exist, although they receive, again, little attention. And they vary in the extent to which they explicitly focus on rural instructional preparation. Also, very little research has been conducted to better understand the potential best models and practices of these programs. So greater political motivation, I suspect, will be needed at state, regional, and national levels to support such programs, highlight their need and utility, and counter the perception of lower status of educating within rural contexts. Increasing access and use value of higher education for rural America. So while rural students overall compare very favorably with their peers in town and urban places in terms of high school achievement and completion, the same is not the case with regards to post-secondary education. The aim of increasing rural college going is fully consistent, I think, with rural economic development, as increased opportunities in rural areas will very likely increase student motivation for college attendance, as well as the attraction and retention of skilled and educated people in rural areas. Relatively strong secondary school outcomes among rural youth should suggest stronger rates of college going, but there are a number of factors that work to depress college attendance and post-secondary attainment among rural students. These include cost barriers, physical distance from colleges and universities, weaker precedents for college going within rural areas. Success within rural economies in the past did not necessarily depend on a college degree. And of course, also we have to mention the skyrocketing costs of college education now. And I would argue the public underinvestment in higher ed. So strategies to increase post-secondary attainment in rural areas should involve not only increasing access to higher education, but also offering opportunities that make sense for rural students. So these kinds of opportunities might include better community college access, which might be perceived as more practical and more relevant to local career opportunities, as well as less expensive and logistically complex than relocation and enrollment within a residential college program. Community college enrollment can also act as an effective stepping stone to further post-secondary education. Further, historically, the establishment and state support of rural community colleges has found to be strongly associated with employment growth in rural areas. Institutions of higher education may well overlook rural youth because they do not perceive a big market of college-aspiring youth in rural areas, and many colleges are still unaware of the need. However, some programs do exist that attempt to increase higher education access for rural students, but they are relatively few in numbers, and there are few systematic evaluations of their effectiveness. So programs like these deserve further attention. And I'm going to begin to wrap up now. So the U.S. lacks a coherent policy vision for rural education, but the same can be said of U.S. rural policy in general. But I think a critical rethinking of educational policy in the rural context might help to suggest new ways of envisioning educational practice that enhances the vitality of rural communities and clarifies a U.S. rural policy. Ultimately, this discussion challenges us to revisit the purpose of education, which I've sort of been, circling around this entire talk, really. So rural development debates, in some respects, have some striking parallels to education policy debates. The rural development policy choice can be broken down into arguments prioritizing equity or efficiency. So proponents of efficiency arguments tend to argue that in comparison to urban economies, rural economies are less competitive, and that free market organization implies that capital flows, including human capital in the form of migration, from rural to urban places, they're appropriate and desirable, given the higher returns on investments in urban places. In this respect, then, rural communities are not as intrinsically valued as social spaces, and the best policy choice is to further enhance the mobility of human and fiscal resources instead of throwing good money after bad by continuing to subsidize economically lagging communities. By contrast, equity proponents argue that the policy choice emphasizing efficiency will inevitably lead to continued inequality and the devaluing of community. The relation to the educational policy debate should be fairly clear in the ways that schools and schooling are understood. Are schools best understood as interchangeable sites of human capital production, best managed and controlled by standardized means to increase competition and efficiency? Or should we think about them as intrinsically valuable and socially meaningful places of community engagement, providing not only education but also collective identity, strong community agency, and other economic and social benefits? So I've tried to suggest here that by reconnecting education with community and locality, while at the same time embracing the innovation and flexibility required to successfully navigate a complex, uncertain, and globally interconnected world, we can reframe education's purpose in more democratic terms. These terms ultimately are a way of not only reimagining rural educational policy and rural educational leadership, but also reimagining an approach to rural development that rests upon the democratic potential and the collective capacity of our rural communities. And so that's my stump speech in this election season.
So we have about 20 minutes or more to actually engage in some question and answer and also reflection. So I would welcome any questions at this point or comments. Yes, Gary?
Hi, one of the things that growing your own rural educator that I found you have to be very careful of. This is an excellent idea, and I support it. When the rural educator leaves their hometown, gets an education, and comes back to their hometown, if they're teaching at least on high school level, they're standing in front of a group of students who are all their relatives. And my experience has been the classroom manager, no problem with understanding. I hired a math and science teacher who was absolutely mind-boggling, but everybody in front of her was cousins, sisters, brothers, and so on. Ultimately, had to say, maybe there's something else you need to do. Unfortunately, I toss that out as one of the ideas that we have to be careful of when we grow our own rural education.
Yeah, that's a really good and a really interesting comment, and I think that there is a potential danger in growing your own, and in the process developing sort of a more what's the word I'm looking for here? A core of teachers that are insulated within the community. That is, that you're not bringing in outside perspectives, outside voices. You're not building connections with the outside. I know that in higher education, for example, there are some very strong norms against hiring from within, hiring recent graduate students into the cohort of faculty members. And so I think that this is an issue for sure. But at the same time, I see, number one, I see this being an issue more for some places than for other places. And number two, the grow your own strategy I see as part of a much broader portfolio of efforts that are geared towards trying to enhance the social and economic vitality and viability of community. So I see this as part of a much broader array of strategies. But I think that is definitely a risk, particularly in the most small communities.
I'm curious to hear you talk about the role of technology in either cultivating rural educators or in sort of reinvigorating rural schools.
The role of technology. Well, in 2016, we're at a very different place than we were in 2000, or in 1996. In terms of access to broadband diffusion, technology within schools, I think that there are lots and lots of opportunities for educators and administrators to use technology in many, many innovative ways to strengthen education and to build connections, to build intellectual and social and institutional connections beyond the locality. And really, I see rural education and rural educational leadership really as not being about the rural place. I really see it as being about how the rural place is connected in with this much larger and broader world, while at the same time identifying all the ways in which the rural place is intrinsically meaningful, an intrinsically good place. Now, one of the issues that we found in Pennsylvania recently with technology and broadband diffusion is connected to charter schools. And so we just have finished a series of studies on charter schools, of which I played sort of a supporting role. Charter school research is not my main thing. But what we found was that in Pennsylvania, a state that has really pushed for charter schools, you have two different kinds of charter schools, right? You have brick and mortar, and you have cyber charters. Not surprisingly, almost all of the brick and mortar charter schools are in urban places, urban and suburban places. Some of those charter schools are pretty good. Some of them are not so good, just like any other school. And in rural areas, you don't tend to have brick and mortar charter schools. I think in Pennsylvania there are 6, maybe 7. And so what's the option of first resort for students who want to exercise school choice and explore the charter school option? Well, the option is cyberschooling. And what we found in Pennsylvania is that the academic outcomes for cyberschooling students are pretty disastrous. We were looking at, again, test scores. Standardized test scores is not necessarily the ideal metric, and you have problems with selectivity of students going from one type of school to another. But we were looking at math and reading scores, and in I think 98% of the cases in which a student transferred from a public school district to a cyber charter, they were going from a higher performing educational environment to a lower performing educational environment, 98%. And in reading, it was not quite that high, but it was still fairly astounding. So I think that technology in rural areas certainly opens up the possibility of different kinds of school choice, but that kind of school choice may not be a very good one. It also points to the kinds of inequities, structural inequities between rural and urban places in terms of charter schools and charter school choice. As well, when students opt for charter schools in rural areas, the public schools often find themselves taking a fairly substantial financial hit because the money goes from the school district to the charter school, and yet unlike cyber charters, school districts, brick and mortar school districts have lots of fixed costs which they have to cover. So I think that there are there's a number of advantages and opportunities and possibilities, but there, as with anything, there are often unanticipated consequences that we need to be aware of, and we need to be cognizant of. And certainly for me, seeing the differences in the options for charter schools between urban students and rural students, number one, and then number two, seeing the kinds of academic outcomes from cyber charters was really eye-opening.
Thanks, Kai. A couple thoughts and comments just to kind of expand, I think, on exactly what you're saying. So often we get into these conversations about growing our own, we get into these conversations around this rural brain drain kind of phenomenon. And people say, well, how do we keep our kids here? And as if we want to build a fence around the local communities, not having our kids go. And I say, no. That's not, in my book, it's not a proposed strategy just to lock kids in. You mentioned briefly that some of these rural, more economically vibrant communities have this very, very healthy practice of sending their kids away for college or work, and they come back with a spouse, they come back with ideas, they come back with other skills to enrich them. But there's a magnet, there's a reason for them to come back. This is a vibrant community. The other piece that I always go to on these issues is to get away from thinking a single local community, a single local superintendent, a single local principal can do this alone. And engage in partnership with local municipal governments, the county government, neighboring superintendents, neighboring educators, because the going it alone is so very hard and almost futile. But to think a bit more regionally about that, where you can create a more regional economy so that you can have your kids go off to school and come back, but give them a reason to come back. And one town at a time is very hard to do, but collectively it's a little easier. Comments?
Well, John, I'm not going to argue with you on that. No, I think that's exactly right. What we know about vibrant communities and community development in general is that it's deeply interconnected with building these strong formal and informal networks of cooperation and collaboration. I think the trick is figuring out where the openings are, where the possibilities are. And when I was doing work on student transiency in upstate New York some years ago, practically back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth, I was working with a school district, and we were collecting data, looking at exactly where students were coming from and going to. And this was a high poverty district with lots of student transiency. They had almost a 30% student turnover rate, annual turnover rate, and they were trying to figure out what to do about it. And they tended to think about the problem as their problem. What can we do about this? And I took those data and I loaded it into a geographic mapping software program, and I made some maps of their district and the surrounding districts and color-coded the districts to show them the density of student movement, where students were coming from and where they were going to. It turned out that I think 50% of the movement was to contiguous districts, and 75% of the movement was within the county, if I'm recalling correctly, and I think I am. They took a look at at those maps, and they said, "Oh, wow, that's really interesting," and they they realized that what the maps illustrated, they kind of already knew just from their day-to-day working knowledge, in terms of record keeping and this kind of thing. Like, oh yeah, we knew that a lot of kids came from that district, but we never knew how many until now, or what the percentage was. And so they formed a consortium to deal with the transient school, the transient student situation. And the consortium was a consortium of districts that were the districts that shared most of these students that were bouncing back and forth. And what they did was they applied for, I think, a 21st Century Learning Center grant that was focused around ensuring wraparound services for students who transfer across districts, basically streamlining the administrative process and ensuring that that care was not broken. And so I think that's a really good example of people, of local leaders understanding or suddenly seeing where some of the possibilities are for building these kinds of collaborations. Now, the counter example of that is, I remember doing this work in another district and talking to the superintendent and saying, so you have a lot of students who are bouncing in and out of your district. What kind of programs do you have in place to help stabilize these students? And he said, stabilize these students? They're not even our students. We don't want them here. Which completely missed the understanding that this is a revolving door across districts, number one. And number two, in framing it as, these aren't our students, well, whose students are they? If they're not your students, whose students are they? Guess what? They're nobody's students. And ironically, it was the emphasis on high-stakes testing and the fear that these transient students represented liabilities in the form of potentially reduced test scores that contributed to the inclination of not all, but some local leaders and administrators to see these students as not their students.
Kai, I just wanted to expand just a little bit about the technological instruction issue that you broached, because I think Pennsylvania's experience with virtual charters is a little different than New York's, because we don't have them. In our law, you have to be a brick and mortar charter school to be a charter school. So the question of instructional technology is more about professional development. It's more about individual coursework that's offered online and expanding the breadth of the curriculum. I often talk to the seniors, the government classes in high school, and I've often asked them what they think is the most dynamic change in public education during my lifetime. And we have great discussions about things like whether it's Common Core or groundwork supportive education. But they eventually get around to asking me what I think is the most instructive, most dynamic. And it's a really lame answer. It's the school bus. The school bus changed everything. And to my way of thinking, the computer, particularly for rural schools, is changing time and distance in much the same way that the school bus did 40, 50 years ago. And New York State in particular is lagging behind other states in its use of available instructional technology, and particularly in rural areas. Some of it's legal in the way that we structure who can teach and how things can be taught, but much more importantly is access, and we're working on that fairly dramatically right now. $2 billion bond act to get schools hooked up, and the federal E-rate program that leverages a great deal more money to do those types of things. But love or hate the Common Core has created a research and development capability for developers of these products that can now sell them anywhere, as opposed to having to individually higher quality. And in some places, they're having tremendous educational success. So I just didn't want to leave the issue with the fact that you're absolutely right. In virtual charter schools, that seems to be a failing experiment. But as individual instructional units that can be accessed in addition to the regular community and regular curriculum within a community, I think it's got tremendous potential.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. As more time unfolds, we'll understand a lot more about what that potential is, and also I think what some of the unintended consequences may also be. My 12-year-old at home, he has an iPod through his school, and he really loves it, and he does a lot of stuff on it. But he does a lot of stuff on it. He spends a lot of time on the iPad, and these devices are amazing too. I was so happy for my smartphone finding my way over here. It really is a wonderful device, and I was like, thank you, smartphone, thank you for getting me here. But at the same time, we live in an age of this. Right? And I'm not always convinced that that's such a great thing either. But other questions? Yeah.
My husband and I raised 3 children in a very rural area. All 3 children went to college and promptly moved into urban areas. In their 30s now, 2 of them have come back with their families. One who said, absolutely would he never live in our town. But what's enabling them to do that is technology, because he and his wife both have design jobs in New York City, and they don't require a place. They can do everything electronically. Yeah. So I think economically, we're going to see technology make big changes in rural areas.
I think that you're absolutely right. And I think that is a wonderful argument for continuing to increase broadband diffusion, and also for really trying to identify good models of local development that have been spurred by exactly that. Yeah, so that's great to hear, and it's interesting too. When I did a lot of these focus groups on youth aspirations, talking with community members. A lot of times you'd hear, yeah, my kid, he says he's never going to live here. He hates this place. He can get out of here as soon as he can. But we don't believe him. They all say that. They all say that. But then they come back. So it's funny to hear you say that too. And I'm glad they're doing well.
I was fascinated by your trout exhibit. You had a rural school that had a wind mill and trout program, and I'm wondering, I can envision, you've probably seen 1,000 or more rural schools, and they have, you said, a lot of these kinds of programs going on, and you don't necessarily hear the positives, you hear the negatives.
Right.
Who comes up with those brainchild ideas? In your experience, I can guess who, you might have a fantastic teacher, 1 in a million type of thing, but generally speaking, these programs, who actually brainchilds that? Who says, hey, let's get this done?
This was so cool, right? Because literally what happened...
Carries it through, has that vision in here.
Yeah, literally what happened, it's a small school, right? And the gym teacher was an avid fisherman. And he was like, man, it'd be really cool to have grow trout here at the school. That'd be awesome. Grow trout, get the kids involved with it. He talked to the biology teacher, and the biology teacher said, yeah, that'd be pretty neat. How would we do it? They went and talked to the building principal. The principal's like, well, yeah, what are the possibilities? I'll never forget, as a teenager, I forget the context, but I was asked to do something. And I said, well, I don't really know how to do that. And the person I was talking with said, well, if you knew how to do it, what would it look like? So these guys didn't know what they were doing. They had no idea, and they certainly didn't one day say, "Oh, let's build a trout nursery, and let's couple it with a greenhouse, attached greenhouse and an outdoor educational laboratory, make it off grid, do all this." It was organic. It kind of built on itself, and it built as they identified resources that they could draw from, financial and human resources that they could draw from, as they built connections. And that gets back to John Sippel's comment about not going it alone. These guys clearly did not go it alone. They did it through all these formal and informal connections within and beyond the community, with local people, with local organizations, with state organizations, and they did it all through grant funding and sweat equity. The other thing I would say about that is that I've often found it very ironic that I'm a professor of education, because some of my worst experiences were in public schools. I really didn't like going to school. And as I began to do work in schools as a researcher, as a graduate student, I had to even kind of overcome some of my heebie-jeebies about even going into a school building. But when I visited this school, I got really excited. I was like, man, it would be really cool to be a student here. Work with trout, and then like the whole idea of like growing plants and then going out into the woods and trying to remediate these mine tailing sites, and learn about water quality and being in charge of the trout. I just thought that was so cool. So it was interesting to me just phenomenologically to sort of experience what I felt being in that place. But I think that a lot of times that's where those kinds of ideas come from, is just the imagination. Like, to do something first, you have to imagine it. And I think that that's a lesson that can be applied to educational leadership and rural educational leadership as well. Because I see so much of rural educational leadership as being connected to figuring out strategic ways of expanding the imagination of how young people understand what is possible for them, possible in their communities, and possible in their lives. And that has nothing to do with this work.
Thanks, Kai. We have one more question, but I just want to make a comment about that, because David Little, who was just speaking a minute ago, who put on an innovation summit around rural schools just a couple of weeks ago, had as one of the presenters a person from a western New York school district that they do everything from raising deer, doing management work, including tagging deer and turkeys and raising fish and all kinds of things. So you may want to talk to David about that on break. Amazing programs that are being put in place. And I think one of the things about rural schools that has always been such a great feature is the flexibility, the ability to have an idea and within 3 weeks it can be happening, because they're flexible. You can move a small ship rather quickly, and being a kayaker, I know that. Although there are some dangers, I would say. But anyway, I'm going to turn it over to Mara to ask her last question, and then we're going to be on break, and I will go through what we have coming up next.
Great, thanks. So my question is about the language that we use to talk to kids about their choices, thinking about after high school. And as you start to look at a lot of the research, I've noticed that it is often framed in terms of staying or leaving. And I think parents often think about, my kids will either stay or leave. Counselors, guidance counselors talk about staying and leaving. But you referenced, and a number of other people here, that there's so many other ways of doing that. And you might stay for a bit, but you might leave for a bit, some further education, return. You might leave, you might then come back. You might leave, you might go to a community similar though. And I guess I'm just wondering to hear if you've got any thoughts on how language constrains how we talk to children about what the possibilities are and what they see as their possibilities after high school.
Well, I have some thoughts on that, but I'm curious about what you think about that. I mean, how would you talk about about those kinds of issues with young people in rural areas. Because I think on the one hand, you get to a critical life junction, which is, all right, I'm done with high school, so what next? On some level, there is kind of a crude binary. That crude binary is, well, I'm going to stay here or I'm going to go somewhere else. And it's going to be one of the others. In rural scholarship, in the last 10 years or so, there's been a really interesting, some people call it a turn, towards thinking about mobilities in general. So it's not whether you go or whether you stay, it's really about how to understand our positionality within a world that is necessarily interconnected and necessarily always in motion. So we're talking about the mobility of symbolic meanings around success and around rural and around urban. We're talking about the mobility of technology, cyber bits floating all over the place. We're talking about the mobility of global capital, perhaps in the very concrete form of water trucks rolling down the road in Pennsylvania towards fracking pads. We're talking about economic mobility. So that gets really complex really quickly, and so I guess that's sort of why I responded in the way that I did, because I don't think I would sit down with my 12-year-old and say, well, Emmett, let me tell you about the scholarly turn towards mobilities and stay. So let's not talk about whether you're going to stay or whether you're going to go, but let's think more postmodern, more postmodernly.
Right.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I think what I'm finding in my research is that maybe with some guidance counselors, I think I'm seeing a lag in thinking about mobility in that kind of flexible way after high school.
Right.
And so it's staying or leaving, and leaving is this sort of big, complex box that's not unpacked.
Right.
And so I guess maybe what you're articulating is there's a bit of a gap between research and practice, and those conversations are happening with children and students as they think about their choices.
Yeah. Well, and two, let's face it, we are in my opinion, a very scary time where there are all kinds of uncertainties. All kinds of uncertainties. Uncertainties about where we're going to be economically, uncertainties about climate change, uncertainties about terrorism, and so it's not surprising to me that I don't know if that's even a lag, what you're seeing, so much as an uncertainty about knowing how to advise young people. I mean, going back to the Pennsylvania example, there was the rural superintendent who said, if I don't, my job is to prepare kids to leave because there's no opportunities here. Fast forward 5 years, boomtown. There's trucks, there's well paths, there's all kinds of people coming in from out of state for jobs. There are people from multiple places saying, this is an amazing opportunity. This is going to be generational. This is going to be generational for Pennsylvania. Fast forward 5 years. It's done. I mean, it's done for now. If you go to Bradford County, it's done. Maybe it comes back when gas goes back up to $4 a gallon. Who knows? I mean, the world is so incredibly uncertain right now, and so this is one of the real fears that I have about structure of education as well, because in our assessments and in our accountability, we revert to, by default, we revert to individual assessment, an assessment that's based on right and wrong answers. And that seems to me to be incredibly dangerous at this historical moment. Because in my experience as an adult, I rarely come into a situation where there are clearly right and wrong answers. It's all gray. And number two, especially as we talk about, go at your own strategies versus collaboration and cooperation, there's a strong need for accountability around how we teach young people to think in connected ways and in collaborative ways, and how to work together and how to deal with uncertainty. And I guess because we're so immersed in this crazy political season, and I won't make partisan comments about it, but it's striking to me how there's so little tolerance for gray area, for indeterminacy. It's got to be either this or it's got to be that. And in our national government, we see a complete collapse of its efficacy because people can't work together. So I've riffed around high stakes tests in the past, and I look at this stuff and I think, oh man, well these are high stakes tests that we're just failing. We're failing these high stakes tests, and they're pretty high stakes.
So on that uplifting note,
yes.
So what I would say is I want to reflect a little bit on my experience just in the last week. Maybe it's a little bit of light at the end of this tunnel. I have a little bit of faith in the kinds of science and engineering practices and mathematical practices that are embedded within these standards, because I've been in kindergarten, first grade, and second grade classrooms where students are using the mobile technologies as only a means to capture and explain things, and moving away from skill and drill, but rather as tools to engage in rich mathematical thinking. It's amazing to me. I've got some great videos I'd love to share with folks at some point of kids, first graders, talking about, wow, I really like that choice of numbers. Those are friendly numbers. Good choice. And they're critiquing each other's choices. They're digging into real problems and using interactive apps that are more open and allow them to be creative thinkers and to be mathematizers at kindergarten or first grade, second grade. I think that there is sort of a flip side to this, which is that constant pushback to find equilibrium. My background in physics and mathematics gives me hope, because there are patterns out there, and there's always this push for equilibrium. And I think that as much as this polarity, there's also this natural force for equilibrium. So I think there's a lot of really exciting, interesting things out there. And we have a really great set of breakout sessions that dig into some of that. One of those things I want to mention is that we have 3 different sets of presenters today that are talking about investing in innovation programs. So resources that are coming back to rural communities. These are folks that are doing this work, bringing these resources back into rural communities. That's very exciting. We have some folks such as Mara, who was just asking this question, who's really looked closely at what's going on in rural schools. We have lots of opportunities for before and after school options and some different programming that seems to be helping there, as well as opportunities this afternoon to get together and have roundtables around really critical topics for us as proponents of rural schools and communities. So I think there's a lot going on. Kai has really kind of put out a lot of really interesting ideas and things for us to think about as we attack these more pragmatic issues. So I really appreciate it. I want to thank you, Kai, for a really great talk, and the day's just begun. So we will start our next breakout session at 11:45, and one session will be here, one will be across the hall in that small room that you saw as you came in when you were signing up for your breakout sessions, and there's an additional session a little further down if you like to walk, as Jerry said. Any other comments or logistics, Jerry?
The only other logistics is we have this one breakout session before lunch. Lunch will be served in 110A where we had the refreshments